63, Milk and Butter Money. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how milk and butter changed from a home good to something that could be sold, and how the knowledge of producing milk and butter, and even cheese, was also worth money. We will meet the Dairy Maid, one of the businesswomen of the colonial age, and deal more with how to do dairy when there was no refrigeration. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know, remember this week, is that when milk comes out of a cow, it is cow body temperature, around 101 Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. This nutrient-rich blood temperature fluid, when it hits the air, which is all full of oxygen and, bacteria and spores, is in danger of getting colonized by little single-celled somethings that will eat up all the goodness before the humans got to it. So to stop that from happening, a whole series of activities were engaged in. To remember what those were, you can go back to episodes 18 and 19. In the 17th century, this was mostly done by a good wife or one of her daughters for the home. By the 18th century, there were quite a few people, still women actually, who did this sort of work as a living, and they were respected as skilled workers. Along with practice in cow handling, and yes, I mean dairy cow here, the precision needed to milk cows efficiently, the cleanliness and the routines and the chemical knowledge required to produce good dairy products were all valuable skills in a world that lacked things like thermometers, soap, and hot running water. Colonial dairies may have turned out far fewer products than we do now, but because everything had to be done by hand and by individuals, dairying was a knowledge-heavy proposition. If you think about all the things that happen in your life, lights turning on, the heat starting up, a cup of coffee appearing at the push of a button, on your machine or on an app, how your clothes are clean, and on and on and on. All these things that make getting up in the morning and then starting your tasks for the day are able to just kind of happen. These things used to require someone to do it, and to do them well, the people had to keep that specific information in their head. Bank the fire, revive the fire, trim a lantern or candle wick, boil the water, steep the tea, or brew the beer or cider. We are still in the beer and cider ages after all, and reheat last night's dinner. Anyway, you get the picture. As I toss a tea bag into the hot water I got from an unattended electric kettle that beeped at me to let me know it was done, and then shut itself off, and then splashed in a little milk, I could get lost in the tasks, knowledge, and expertise contained in my spun stainless steel insulated tumbler of tea. I bring this all up not to shame us lazy modern people, but instead to get us to look around and consider how being a dairy maid in the 18th century meant you were a member of the technology class of worker. This was kind of a prestige occupation where you were paid and relatively well, had nice job perks, and your job security lay in your maintaining physical health much more than any whims of an employer. And you were an essential worker, even if you were a woman. All in all, if you needed a position for pay, it was a good, if not pretty high status gig for its time and place. As I've mentioned before, we often get this idea in our heads that life on the frontier was completely self-sufficient, and yet somehow done by just a nuclear family, that is, parents and kids. But if you look at all the things that had to get done and also the way people lived, when you add up all the hours, you realize that wasn't possible. It had to be more of a community effort. There had to be specialists. Oh yeah, and those people really doing it on their own, they were kind of in trouble and had raggedy, dirty clothes and didn't eat so well and also never had time to write in journals. So anyway, as the cattle population of the colonies was increasing and dairies were going in the Northeast where crop growing was poor, or in Virginia where tobacco had drained the land, or in the southern colonies where the self-sufficient fiefdoms of plantations were setting up, the phenomenon of colonial dairies appeared. One or two cow homesteads still existed and functioned pretty similarly to how it had in the last century, though likely had more metal implements, which made keeping things clean a little easier. What was really new was dairies were starting to become standalone operations. In the Low Countries, the places that are now Holland and parts of Belgium and Germany, where dairying and especially export cheese making had been established for centuries, this was not news. But for the English colonies, this was news. Remember, at this point, people in the know keeping food notes spoke of good or hard yellow Dutch cheese or importing Italian Parmesan. There just wasn't much dairy innovation back on the home island. English recipes don't really mention cheese. Milk and its products were only very local. Maybe cream for the rich and some summer butter, but that was about it. The milk stayed at home. But in the 18th century, there were quite a few Dutch farmers about in the colonies, and with all that land, there were more people with cows and places to set up dairies and spring houses and wells and cooling centers. There was plenty of land to find a clean, shady spot. There wasn't just innovation in metal pots and pans. That's right, there was innovation in buildings where dairy was happening. Just as people were starting to build multi-room cabins and houses with the new availability of lumber and nails, they were also building outbuildings. And with those nice new iron digging tools, cellars or sunken floors were being dug to create the coolest places possible for the incoming summer milk. There were rocks and tiles and bricks to line and pave these dug-in, cooled, sunken, or underground rooms and buildings, and plenty of lumber for wide, shady roofs. The windowless spaces with wide roofs of overhanging eaves that allowed circulation of air through high-up vents covered with grills and grates were kept as separate and spotless as possible. Also when possible, the milk processing area was kept away from smoke and any other airs and odors that might sully the milk or make it go wrong. With all this newly claimed land, there was space for dairy. With all these bustling port cities, there were people to buy dairy products, so there was a thriving job market for people who could do a good job of dealing with dairy. Enter the colonial dairy maid. Like spinsters, that is, young women who traveled between farms to deal with the finicky and demanding tasks of processing and spinning wool and flax, dairy maids were also typically single women who earned their own living. As it was a seasonal occupation, many a dairy maid also doubled as a brewster or brewer of beer. This is borne out by servant advertisements asking for such, and offering even higher wages if they could do both. Which, if you think about it, makes sense. Cows would drop their calves in the spring and dairy season would begin, with high milk and cream time in the summer, which, let's face it, is very annoying from a refrigeration perspective. But what are you going to do? As milk production begins to wind up in the fall and ends in the winter as the calves are weaned, that's when beer brewing got going. Harvest time for cereal grains would happen at the end of summer. Then the malting would line up with the end of the dairying season. So the brewing of beer with summer's grains would fill up the time empty of milk to process. And high-quality beer brewing and milk handling were complementary in other ways. They both required the understanding of correct temperatures. A nose for certain smells was essential. Is this cream off? Has this wort gone bad? Or is it okay? And the need to keep the equipment clean meant the difference between bad beer, or bad butter, and the good. Speaking of bad or good butter, let's talk butter molds. Last time we talked about butter, I mentioned that cultured butter or butter made with slightly fermented cream was the norm in the colonies. Even as these multi-cow dairies sprung up, it was still tangy butter all the way. And this was largely due to the need to let the cream literally rise to the top. After stripping the milk from the cows on a given morning or evening, the fresh milk has to cool, in the spring house or in these new dairy houses people were building. The fresh warm milk from the cow has the cream and the butter fat all mixed in with all the other stuff. But it could only cool and separate so fast when even the coolest places were in the mid-40s or low 50s Fahrenheit. That's between 5 to 10 degrees C, and often quite a bit warmer. There was no way to speed up the cooling and the clumping of the cream. But when it finally did get together, the cream would be collected and placed in the churn. By the time it was correctly cool enough and enough had been collected to make the chore of churning worthwhile, the cream would have clabbered slightly. This was actually a bit protective of butter quality. If the desired souring had happened, that meant there was no real estate for the bad bugs to get in. The one exception to cultured butter might be at the height of cream production. When there was so much cream, butter could be made fresh, and this sweet summer butter was definitely a treat, but it had to be eaten up quick. Anyway, churning and churning and churning and churning the butter until it went from liquid to solid chunks swimming in whey. And then in this century, same as the last, this was rinsed and salted to keep it sound, and then stamped with butter molds. These butter stamps were actually considered some of the first branding. The wooden forms used were carved with a flower or leaf design, or, you'll never guess what, a pineapple shape. A given design would come to be associated with the work of one dairy maid or even one dairy or another, and people would come to choose their butter by these shapes when they had a choice. Because the larger dairies were located near large cities, some of the first colonial milk sellers started to appear. These were vendors who would have large buckets with a smaller bucket inside and a ladle to serve up a swallow of milk. These vendors were only to be found in the more northerly port towns, for between the smaller bucket and the larger bucket was water, which evaporated and kept the milk cool. Or sometimes, they even had ice. Yes, the ponds and rivers of the Northeast, and even all the way down to Virginia, when they froze solid, would be harvested for their ice. Stored in specially dug cellars lined with hay, they would store ice blocks cut with saws in the winter. An ancient practice in Europe and Central Asia, even back to antiquity, pits would be dug to hold snow and ice, so the ability to have ice during the sweltering summer was a trick that had been mastered. I mean, if you were terribly rich. But in the colonies, where just about everyone had prime access to good water and plenty of land, ice houses could be dug, ice could be cut, and what acted as refrigerators for only the most wealthy back at home was now something far more people could create in this new world. And so while a nice cold bottle of milk, remember, glass is still extremely expensive, waiting about in your kitchen was unlikely, a draft of cool milk on the street was possible, as was a stone crock of milk in the pantry for sauces or boiled for breakfast was available, at least in the summer when it was milk time. So milk didn't travel far, but it was traveling away from homes, and it was another street food to be found in the big city. Which brings us back around to our dairy maids. Because these were usually young single women who were associated with this healthy, wholesome food and were often pretty healthy themselves, getting lots of exercise, fresh air, and a decent diet because they had access to milk and were usually paid well enough to afford reasonable food, lodging, and clothing, they were often held up as a symbol of wholesomeness themselves. The wholesomeness and the healthiness of the dairy maid was also helped along by the cowpox. For dairy maids were regularly observed to not catch the smallpox whenever it flowed through the colonies. An especially bad one was in 1721, and another rash came through in the 1750s. The Dairy Maid Smallpox Association will come to its dramatic conclusion after the Revolutionary War. And this would go on to our modern age as well. And yet, as independent women, they were also some of the most socially free of their time. They only get to marry the Duke and the bodice rippers. See, in real life, they never make it to the front rooms of the house, for she would smell of cow. But as a businesswoman who was unusually mobile for her time, she was able to socialize with a much wider range of the world than most women of her time, selling her butter and her milk, and talking to the farm workers doing the plowing and the herding and so on, which leads to the other association of the dairy maid, a lusty young woman, and the body poetry and the songs of the age make it clear. The colonial slave codes that had been incorporated into most of the colonial laws by the end of the 1670s usually had sections outlawing miscegenation or marriage and intimate partnerships between racial groups. According to court records, a large number of the women found to be in violation of these rules were dairy maids. Apparently, Unlike inside servants, such misbehavior wasn't too much of a disqualification for employment in these labor-hungry colonies, especially since these women carried around in their heads exclusive milk-associated technology. This period of time, when women could wander about as independent businesswomen, spinning or dairying, was short. It seems to have lasted for about 50 years, more or less. The cities will become more organized. Dairies, like breweries, will become larger, male-owned operations. Remember that property owning exclusion? No ladies can sign contracts. And the Dairy Maid will become more of a low-wage worker, doing more repetitive tasks, as the technology around dairying becomes more regularized. Oh, and another thing. Black and mixed race dairy maids. They never show up in the paintings. Milk maids with milk-white skin was always a thing. But on plantations, where just about every job of physical labor was assigned to Africans, including things we think of as being done exclusively by European colonists, miller, brewer, beekeeper, and dairy maid. And because our dairy maids were out there, breaking laws by associating with her choice of partners, there were many children of dairy maids who were mixed race. Since this was a profession that was both necessary but physical and largely out of sight of the better sort of people, it was actually a landing spot of many of these women who would not be considered employable in positions thought of as respectable or were more visible. And again, away with the cows and the cream could win out over pesky considerations like appearance. And if a good hand with butter was prized, an even trickier proposition was the making of cheese. Back in the 17th century, I went over the basics of cheese making, but I left out most of the fine points. A colonial innovation was the manufacture of cream cheeses. Again, milk production at this point was incredibly seasonal, and the amount of cream and milk fluctuated with the age of the calf, which meant as milking season went on, there would be a peak of cream in the early summer. And then throughout the rest of the milking cycle, the amount of cream would reduce. Back when it was more typical to have just a cow or two, the result of this would be just a couple of weeks of sweet butter or extra creamy milk. But in the growing dairy operations of the colonies, it could actually mean problems of a cream surplus. How to preserve this cream in a way that it could be sold, especially in a way that waits out the cream surplus everyone else is having. Last time I talked about cheese, I mentioned quickly the development of cream cheese, and in the colonies it was done in the style of Western French or Northeastern Swiss Neufchâtel cheese. However, the amount of cream being used or the richness of the cream being used, I'm unclear on the specifics. It made a richer, fattier cheese. Neufchâtel has a curdier texture, while the American style was creamier, more like a super thick mascarpone, which is a soft, fluffy Italian cream cheese. And this rich cheese would preserve the extra cream and could also be sold at a premium, thus making these extra creamy cheeses a way to preserve that high mark of cream production. In England, there's also a designation of double cream, which stands in for extra thick cream. That was also a product of this season, but other than just meaning more expensive, what exactly is going on here? The English double cream, that was simply combining all the cream from several milk batches and then re-skimming the combined cream to isolate the thickest bit. This extra thick cream would have a lower water content than regular single cream, and it would be much easier to whip up with a bunch of twigs that were standing in for whisks at this point. There was still no or very little wire in the world, so wire whisks and beaters are not a thing yet. Any other types of cheese making were largely out of reach of most of the colonial dairy maids for two big reasons. Successful European dairy maids with the great secrets of cheese making were not in need of a better position, so were not making desperate voyages across the ocean to strange lands. And much of the infrastructure for aging cheeses of these fine types were simply not the sorts of things being built. Smokehouses, dairy houses, fish drying racks, sure. The colonies were in a hurry and mainly focused on sending raw-ish materials back to the home island and out into the world in search of cash. We weren't aging wine or beer, and spirits aging was only happening by accident. So the arts of aging cheese, doing this for more than was absolutely necessary, that was an art largely outside of the colonial playbook or cookbook. So we are still a land of milk, clabber and cream, and very young cheese. Next week, it's time to learn more about ice and the rise of the dessert course as molasses and sugar meet up with the increased amount of milk and cream. It's not quite ice cream yet, but cream cakes for sure. Thanks for listening. Any questions or quibbles will reach me by email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter at THOAfood, where I am most active. For now, I hope that stays the same. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help make me more visible to the food and history curious alike. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at THOAfood and in the show description.